Hello, fabulous scholars. So, Odd has banished the frost giant, and Freya has turned Odin, Thor, and Loki back into their original shapes, not the animals anymore. And then she says it's Odd's turn. And Odd points out, I look like this anyway. I know, said Freya. She knelt down beside him, reached out a hand towards his injured leg. May I? If you want to. She picked him up as if he was as light as a leaf and put him down on the great feasting table of the gods. She reached down to his foot and deftly unhooked it at the knee. She ran a nail across the shin and the flesh parted. It's like she's doing surgery on his leg, but it's not attached to him. Oh my goodness. Freya looked at the bone and her face fell. It was crushed, she said, so much that not even I can repair it. And then she said, but I can help. She pushed her hand into the inside of Odd's leg, kneading the smashed bones, pulling together the fragments from inside the leg, and smoothing them together. Then she opened the flesh of the foot and repeated the same operation, putting the pieces of foot bone and toe bone back where they were meant to be. And then she encased the leg and the foot in flesh once more, sealed it up, and the goddess Freya reattached Odd's leg to Odd, and then it was as if it had always been there. Sorry, she said. I did the best I could do. It's better, but it's not right yet. She seemed lost in thought, and then she said brightly, why don't I replace it entirely? What about a cat's rear leg? Oh, would you like that, Maudie? She says no. Or a chicken's? Odd smiled and shook his head. My leg is fine. Odd stood up cautiously and put his weight on his left leg, trying to pretend that he had not just seen his leg unhooked at the knee. It did not hurt, not really, not like it used to. Give it time, said Freya. A huge hand came down and clapped Odd on the shoulder, sending him flying. Now, laddie, boomed Thor, tell us just how you defeated the might of the frost giants. He seemed much more cheerful than when he had been a bear. There was only one of them, said Odd. When I tell the story, said Thor, there will be at least a dozen. I want my shoes back, said Loki. There was a feast that night in the great mead hall of the gods. Odin sat at the end of the table in the magnificent carved chair, saying almost as little as he had when he was an eagle. Thor, on his left side, boomed enthusiastically. Loki, who had to sit down at the far end of the table, was pleasant enough for a while, and then, like a candle suddenly blowing out, he became unpleasant, and he said mean, foolish, unrepeatable things, and he leered at the goddesses. And soon enough, Thor and a large man with one hand, who Odd thought might have been called Tyr, were carrying Loki from the hall. He doesn't learn, said Odd. He thought he had said it to himself in his head, but Freya, who was sitting next to him, said, no, he doesn't learn. None of them do. And they don't change either. They can't. That's all part of being a god. Odd nodded. He thought he understood, a little. Then Freya said, have you eaten enough? Yes, thank you, said Odd. Old Odin left his chair and walked toward them. He wiped the goose grease from his mouth with his sleeve, smearing even more grease all over his gray beard. Then he said quietly into Odd's ear, do you know what spring it was you drank from, boy? Where that water came from? Do you know what it cost me to drink from there many years ago? You didn't think you defeated the frost giants alone, did you? Odd said only, thank you. No, said Odin, thank you. The Allfather was leaning on a staff carved with faces, dogs and horses and men and birds, skulls and reindeer and mice and women, all of them wrapped around Odin's stick. You could look at it for hours and still not see every detail on that stick. Odin pushed the staff toward Odd and said, "This is for you." Odd said, "But..." The old god looked at him gravely through his one good eye. "It is never wise to refuse the gifts of the gods, boy." Odd said, "Well, thank you." And he took the staff. It was comfortable. It felt as though he could walk a long way as long as he was leaning on that staff. Odin dipped his hand into a pitcher and brought it out holding a small globe of water no larger than a man's eyeball. He placed the water ball in front of a candle flame. "Look into this," he said. Odd looked into the ball of water, and his world became a rainbow, and then it went dark. When he opened his eyes, he was home. Chapter 8. Afterwards. Odd leaned his weight on the staff and looked down into the village. Then he began to walk the path that would take him home. He was still limping, a little. His left foot would never be as strong as his right, but it did not hurt, and he was grateful to Freya for that. As he headed down the path to the village, he heard a rushing noise. It was the sound of snow melting, of new water trying to find its way to lower ground. Sometimes he heard a clump as snow fell from a tree onto the ground beneath, and sometimes a deep thrum, 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 followed by a harsh cracking sound as the ice that had covered the edge of the bay through this endless winter began to cleave and break up. In a few days, Odd thought, this will all be mud. In a few weeks, it will be a riot of greenery. Odd reached the village. For a moment, he wondered if he had come to the wrong place, for nothing looked as he remembered it, looking when he had left, less than a week before. He remembered how the animals had grown when they reached Asgard, and then how they seemed later to have shrunk. He wondered if it was the air of Asgard that did it, or if it had happened when he drank at the pool of water. He reached Fat Alfred's door and he rapped on it sharply with his staff. "Who is it?" called a voice. "It's me, Odd," he said. There was a noise inside the hut, an urgent whispering, and then people talking in low voices. Odd could hear the loudest of the voices as it grumbled about good-for-nothings who stole a side of salmon and how it was high time for someone to be taught a lesson he would never forget. He heard the sound of the door being unbarred. The door opened, and Fat Alfred looked out. He stared up at Odd, confused. "I'm sorry," he said in the most unsorry of voices. "I thought my runaway stepson was here." Odd looked down at the man. Then he smiled and said, "It is him. I mean, it's me. I am him. I'm home." Did you notice how he's changed? He doesn't look like a 12-year-old boy anymore, does he? "I'm Odd." Fat Alfred said nothing. The heads of his various sons and daughters appeared around him. They looked up at Odd nervously. "Is my mother here?" asked Odd. Fat Alfred coughed. "You grew, that if that is you." Odd just smiled. A smile so irritating it had to be him. The smallest of Fat Alfred's children said, "They got into fights after you went away. She said we had to go and look for you and that it was Dad's fault you'd run off. And he said it wasn't and he wouldn't and good riddance to bad rubbish. And she said right then and she went back to your father's old house on the other side of town." Odd winked down at the boy as Thor had once winked at him and turned around and leaning on his carved staff limped through the village, which already seemed much too small for him, and not just because he had grown so much since he had left. Soon the ice would melt and long ships would be sailing. He did not imagine anyone would refuse him a berth on a ship, that means a spot on a long ship. Not now that he was big. They would need a good pair of hands on the oars after all. Nor would they argue. if he chose to bring a passenger. I wonder who that'd be. Who would he bring with him on a longship? He reached down and knocked on the door of the house in which he had been born. And when his mother opened the door, before she could hug him, before she could cry and laugh and cry once more, before she could offer him food and exclaim over how big he'd grown and how fast children do spring up when they're out of your sight, before any of these things could happen, Odd said, "Hello, Mother. Would you like to go back to Scotland at least for a while?" "That would be a fine thing," she said. And Odd smiled and ducked his head to get through the door and went inside. And the last picture. Can you see who Odd brought with him? His mother. The end. Fabulous scholars. I've really enjoyed this book, but I'm super excited about our next one. It is my absolute favorite read aloud, so I can't wait till next time. Bye, scholars.